Okay, Timur, I'm going to start and I will introduce
Yeah,
our,
start please.
the session. Can I start now or should I?
Yeah.
Okay, welcome to our book discussion at the Center for Islam and Global Affairs. Every month we profile a book that we consider to be ground setting in the field and introduce it to our online community and also our staff and students here at the Center for Islam and Global Affairs. I'm really happy and honored that both Michael and Sarah accepted our invitation to profile and share their recent work with us. Um, and the book that we're discussing is titled "From Apartheid, a Blueprint for From Apartheid to Democracy: A Blueprint for Peace in Israel and Palestine." A few words about our esteemed guests, who are also the authors of the book. Michael Schaefer Omerman is the director of Israel-Palestine at Dawn and is a specialist in Israel and Palestinian politics, particularly Israel's occupation and the annexation policies and their human rights record. And he's also an expert on the U.S.-Israeli relationship. He spent decades as a journalist in the region, and he has been the editor-in-chief for magazines, including an editor at the Jerusalem Post. He's covered grassroots movements and civil society organizations. His work is cited often, and as you know, he is the author of the current text that we're examining today. Alongside him is this co-author, Sarah Lee Whitson. She is the executive director at Dawn. She formerly led Human Rights Watch's Middle East and North African division, which oversaw 19 countries under her charge. She has conducted extensive advocacy investigative missions focused on various issues, including conflicts, human rights, policy reform. She is a frequent media commentator, and she's the co-author of the current book. She also has a background in law and consulting in the past, and she's a multilingual and very qualified to speak on the topic. I welcome both of them to SIGA, and we're really excited to engage with their work. Um, who would uh, who would like to speak first? Sarah, I guess, or Michael? How would you guys want to do it?
We're going to pass the baton back and forth. We've kind of got our
Okay, wonderful. That's
top
great. So
down.
I'm going to go silent now, and the floor is both of yours.
Hi, everyone. I'm really grateful to SIGA for allowing us to have this audience with students, scholars, and academics in Turkey and whoever else is tuning in. I know that the people in Turkey have been as interested and as focused on a just resolution for Israel-Palestine as anyone. In fact, I know Turkish civil society has been at the forefront of Palestine advocacy for many decades. So I hope that this book that we're putting forward is going to be a recipe for hope for the future. We are asking a lot of our readers, a lot of our audience to imagine a different future, something that is very, very difficult to do in the very dark reality that we face now. The status quo is catastrophic, but what we want to emphasize more than anything is that this is a man-made problem that requires man-made solutions. We have never been in a moment that is more ripe for new ideas. Ideas not just about where we want to end up, what a just solution looks like, but how we can actually do it, what kind of a plan we can execute to move forward. The genocide in Gaza, the sacrifices of over 60,000 Palestinians who've paid with their lives and their limbs, has jolted the international community out of its convenient slumber. For the past several years, we've been told by the international community, by the United States, by Israel, by Arab governments, that Palestine doesn't matter, that Palestinians don't matter, that we can ignore them, that Arab regimes can just sign little agreements with Israel as if the Palestinians don't exist. But now I think we are all awake and focused on something that needs to change. But what's been missing is an actual plan for what comes next. The starting point in our conversation, in terms of looking at Israel-Palestine, is that there is currently a one-state reality. The one-state reality is an apartheid reality. Israel is a one-state regime that exercises effective control from the river to the sea, what we collectively call the territory. The starting point is that Israel's occupation is illegal, as the International Court of Justice confirmed in its legal opinion last year, and that importantly, Gaza remains occupied, whether or not there's a ceasefire, whether or not there's a Trump plan, and that it is part of the collective whole of Palestine. It is part of the collective whole of the territory. And really, this was the starting point and is the starting point for the blueprint. Mike, do you want to take it over?
Sure. So where we again, thank you to Siga and to everyone for inviting us here. As Sarah Lee laid out, our starting point is a one-state reality with an apartheid regime, and those are facts. That is what exists today. And our new vision is to flip the script of how the traditional international approach to this situation, to this conflict has been, and to prioritize first ending the crimes of occupation and apartheid before we get to issues of statehood and governance. And to do so, and we'll detail in a few minutes a little bit more how we do that, is through a 3-year transitional government, which effectively dismantles the systems of apartheid and the machinery of occupation, and on principles of equality and democracy and human rights, and ultimately ends in a democratic reality where the people, the Palestinians and Israelis who live between the river and the sea, can decide democratically how they want to govern themselves moving forward. So our process for how we did this, again, go to the next slide, Sarah Lee. We interviewed around 100 Palestinians and Israelis and experts around the world about each little piece of this, about what needs to happen, what pitfalls do we need to be wary of, and again, this is on top of the decades of experience that Sarah Lee and I bring from our previous work into this project. We did extensive comparative research into various transitions, post-colonial transitions, democratic transitions, apartheid to democracy transitions, and looked at what worked, what failed, not with the idea that there's a perfect one-size-fits-all answer to this, but that there are lessons to be learned, and that we can do this a lot more smartly, by looking at all these different situations and what worked and didn't work there. This was published by an academic press, so it underwent peer review by 5 scholars. And yeah, so the blueprint itself.
Before we talk about the blueprint itself, I just want to reemphasize 2 points that Mike made, because they are, I think, the crux of and critical to understanding the blueprint. So the Oslo process, which is now dead and I think recognized as dead, one of the reasons why we think it failed is because it made ending Israeli occupation conditional on an agreement, a negotiated solution, settlement, about governance, about borders, about refugees, sort of the final issues. And without that agreement, the occupation remained intact. And in fact, over the past 30 years, the occupation has expanded and worsened, with over 500,000 settlers in the West Bank, with regular intermittent wars of destruction and devastation, particularly in Gaza. Most recently the current ongoing war over the past 2 years, and annexation of territory. So the first way in which our plan represents a radical break from that approach, and also the approach of many peace and conflict resolution strategies, is that we put the issue of ending Israeli crimes of occupation and apartheid as the priority undertaking, unconditional, does not require an agreement on future governance, does not put the onus on Palestinians or the Palestinian Authority to reform or not reform, because from our view and the view of many international law experts, ending crimes can never be conditioned on a counterparty doing or not doing something else. The second way in which this plan is radical and breaks from failed peace-building approaches is that we refuse to allow Palestinians or Israelis to be represented as one monolithic block for each side, quote unquote, the both sides, by unelected, in some cases, criminal representatives. We do not give the Palestinian Authority, which has no electoral legitimacy, which is rife with corruption and abuse, the right to represent and speak on behalf of all Palestinians. And we don't give the criminal Israeli regime, the two most senior leaders of whom have been indicted by the International Criminal Court in an apartheid government, to decide on behalf of Israeli Jews what the Israeli Jewish population will agree to or decide. Instead, we reject that flattened approach of seeing Palestinians and Israeli Jews as only having one feature, and that is their Palestinian identity or their Israeli Jewish identity, to instead give each person living between the river and the sea a vote, a secret vote, so that they can choose whatever they want at the end of the process. But the process itself is designed to create at least the groundwork for democratic decision-making to enable the people living between the river and the sea to democratically decide what their future governance looks like. And back to Mike to describe what the blueprint actually looks like, how we do that.
Yeah, I just I realized that I wanted to say before we get into exactly the details of how this works, that this is a plan for when political will exists. And we believe that we're on a trajectory to get there, but this is not a plan that could be implemented today. It requires a lot of changes in the international community, and we'll detail that in a minute. So from that point of political will, our plan starts with a caretaker transitional government, a 3-year government locally led with international shepherding and help and supervision, where the first thing we do is level the playing field, create equality, create freedom of movement. And the ways to do that are by revoking all the emergency laws that the Israelis have used for the legal basis of the occupation and apartheid, to end military rule, to stop all military operations within the territory and revert to civilian police rule, to immediately restore freedom of movement for everybody, with some not caveats but safeguards, to ensure that chaos doesn't break out. We overhaul the High Court in Israel, which unfortunately has been a major contributor to the sort of building over the years of this occupation and apartheid regime. We mandate equal citizenship for all. Go to the next slide, Sarah Lee. Integrate security forces. Obviously, this is something we go into in much greater detail in the book because it's as complicated as it sounds. But while prioritizing inclusion along with a lustration process to make sure that the worst offenders do not participate in any meaningful way moving forward. That includes a disarmament, demobilization of irregular forces from Palestinian militant groups to Israeli settler militias and others. We release political prisoners, starting with administrative detainees who've never been charged with the process for reviewing everybody else. We put in place the mechanisms and the institutions to start preparing for a resolution to the Palestinian refugee question, as well as other transitional justice matters, which we can get into if people are interested. But the idea being that those processes have to be locally led, and they can't they can't come before, they can't precede a political resolution, because that would affect which avenues for transitional justice are available. And it culminates in democratic elections and optimally a referendum where the first democratic government representing all the people of Palestine and Israel can decide how they want to govern themselves in the future, be that in one, two, three, four states, or a confederation, or a federation, or whatever it may be. And the main difference between doing that after a process like this as opposed to today, because you could reasonably say, why not just hold a referendum today, is that if you did, the fallback would be the current state of occupation and apartheid. And that's not a legitimate choice. That's like, asking a prisoner to choose exile or freedom. That's not a choice. Um, it's not a free choice. Um, so Shirley, you want to take it
And
back?
just to complete the point that Mike was making, the default, if there is no referendum, if a referendum fails, is that we now have one democratic state to replace the one apartheid state. As Mike also alluded earlier, so far the international community has been unable to articulate policy demands on Israel with the specific pathway or blueprint to Palestinian statehood, to ending Israeli occupation and apartheid, to respecting the rights of self-determination and equality for not just Palestinians, but all of the people living in Israel-Palestine. And while many activists on the ground, groups on the ground in Israel-Palestine, like the One Democratic State Initiative or Land for All, have a vision of where they want to end up, what they want the final outcome to look like, they don't have a roadmap for how to get there. And I can confirm that because we asked all of them. So that's really left the international community and policymakers in limbo, because what is the point of pressing forward with sanctions and putting pressure on Israel when there's no off-ramp, when the result, even in the case of a ceasefire, is the chaos that we see in Gaza, and with stealth international moves to impose a new kind of foreign tutelage over a chunk of Gaza, and effectively to continue the expulsion of Palestinians from Gaza without their actual consent. We know what's missing, because our blueprint requires, is the Israeli public's consent to a transition. It also requires the consent of Palestinians as well, but the reality is the power resides with Israelis. But we believe that the weight of international and domestic pressure may persuade Israelis that they do not want to live in global isolation anymore. They do not want to be reviled by the whole world. They want to be able to travel freely. They want to participate in Eurovision concerts and soccer matches without facing global disdain. That they do not want to be in a constant state of war, one war after another. That's really the only thing the Israeli government has delivered for the Israeli people, who, by the way, are paying a steep price in perpetual mandatory military service that follows the few years of actual service with reserve service, making Israelis forever subject to having to being called up to fight. But the problem is that without an alternative and without an off-ramp, there's nowhere for Israelis to go. There's nowhere for Palestinians to go. There's nowhere for the international community to go. So we hope to contribute to the global and domestic pressure on the Israeli public, which is ultimately the key here, by giving an off-ramp, by showing that there's a viable way to end this conflict, to end Israeli crimes, and to allow Israelis and Palestinians to live like normal people with the problems that all the normal countries in the world have.
So yeah, and that's basically why we started to create this project, which ultimately culminated in this book and us speaking with you here today, which is to give policymakers around the world the language to imagine a different way forward. As Sarah Lee said, it's very difficult to make the argument that Israel should be sanctioned in a way that would actually create the type of pressure to bring about change without providing the off-ramp. And so we want to give this to policymakers as both a conceptual but also a practical foundation for what their policies can aim for what they can aim to achieve, and to inspire others to draw up competing visions. So that this is a vibrant debate, because for the past 30 years, and especially in the past 15 or so, when I think everyone would agree that the two-state process has been stalled, if not dead, that its very existence has stopped people, and Sarah Lee explained this a little bit more, has prevented them from discussing anything else, which means that we're stuck in the current reality that we've described today. So that is the short version of our book. We would love to hear from you with your questions, to engage on this, to speak about it, to converse about it, and looking forward to your questions right now as well.
Thank you so much. It's so full of new energy and new ideas, and I'm so happy to see that the project is now kind of making its rounds around people who are taking your solutions so seriously. And I love the way it's future oriented, and hopeful. Um, but for a second, I'd like to go back. So um, uh, maybe it's the moment, or maybe it's time has passed so much that what you're advocating, which is a democratic state in the land, between the river and the sea, uh, seems so intuitive to all of us, because we, in some way or another, live in democratic societies all around the world. And it makes no sense why the people living in that piece of real estate should not also live in a democratic society. Um, but my question is, what were the logics in play in 1948? That prevented this from happening. I mean, it happened everywhere else. What happened in 1948 that prevented this kind of vision from unfolding? And what has changed today that allows for this vision? Or what's different now that makes this vision more important than the logics of 1948, or what was in play at that time?
Well, I'm sure Mike is going to know more than I am, I'll just start with saying that the partition of 1948 effectively pretended that Palestinians didn't really exist. The notion of creating a Palestinian state side by side with Israel was basically an afterthought. The driving momentum of 1948 and what preceded it at the United Nations was the primacy and priority of creating a Jewish homeland in the wake of the Holocaust. And, the fiction that the Zionist intellectual community propagated around the world, given the very strong Jewish diaspora and the non-existent Palestinian diaspora at the time, was that there was nothing there, that it was just sort of random tribes that, Bedouin tribes that moved around randomly. that, you know, it was the land of milk and honey for Israeli Jews, and that this could be a viable homeland for them. Um, uh, you know, maybe the partition might have worked, but obviously war broke out right away. What's different today, of course, is the uh, dramatic intermingling of the Israeli and Palestinian populations, both within Green Line Israel, where Palestinian citizens, or Israeli citizens of Palestinian descent, make up about 20% of the population, in addition to other minority populations there. And in the West Bank, there are over 500,000 Israeli settlers. And I would suspect that there will be increasing numbers of Israeli Jews in the beyond the so-called yellow line in Gaza, because they've been very open about their wish to resettle, physically resettle the lands of Gaza.
Um, I have a very different but not contradictory response, and it's two parts. The first is that the things that made this impossible and that drove 1948 still exist today, and that's one of the problems that we're facing still. And by that I mean the zero-sum attitude that, and forgive me for the homogenization of sides here, but that both sides thought they could have a total victory and push the other out. The Israelis thought that they could reject the partition and push all the Palestinians out of the territory they hoped to control. And there was no Palestinian army or government at the time, but the Arab countries around told all of the Palestinians within the territory between the river and the sea that it was just a matter of time before they would come and liberate the land. And that myth, I think, lived on until at least 1973, when Israel's sort of military resilience, I think, finally resonated around the region. Now that attitude on both sides, that total victory is possible, that eliminating the other or pushing them out is possible, I think is one of the major things that stops people from being willing to consider alternatives. And we had, flirtations with alternatives with the Oslo process, which really did, I think, inspire and give hope to a lot of people. But given its utter failure and how it turned into a just a further entrenched version of apartheid and occupation and genocide, that I think people have reverted more to that zero sum um, viewpoint, political view about what needs to happen. So that's I think one thing that has not changed and that we need to change. Now, what has changed, and Sarah Lee started to talk about this a little bit, is that the same impetus that the world had for creating a Jewish homeland and Jewish self-determination, which ultimately led to the political will that brought about the momentum that created the state of Israel. And this was an international creation by, the partition plan was created by the UN General Assembly and supported by all sorts of powers. I think that we're seeing similar um, moral and realpolitik sort of understanding that Palestinians need the safety of self-determination in the most urgent way right now, and that the genocide and the occupation and the apartheid regimes have to end. And what's really missing is a way to do it. And that can't happen without Israeli consent, because that would be a different type of occupation and a different type of apartheid and genocide. But I think that the fact that as Sarah Lee was saying, Palestinians were invisible in 1948. Today, they're not. And the political will around the world, albeit on the streets and not necessarily in the halls of power, I think recognizes the urgent need to resolve this in a way that gives Palestinians safety. And I think that creates a lot of the political momentum and opportunity to push forth new ideas like the one we've created.
Thank you for that. I think the fact that a total victory scenario is no longer something that people are even capable of imagining, given the stalemate on both sides. Um, I think is an interesting opportunity for peace. And uh, yeah, I think that, yeah, I think there's some teeth in that. One of the issues, as you know, is we've had democratic experiments out of very bloody, violent contexts. So, like, for example, Lebanon is one. There's the experiment. Now we will see, Syria. We will see other state formations that occurred after immense amount of violence, victimization. Um, uh, my question is, there are some successful scenarios. For example, South Africa is a very important, model of how a democratic society may emerge after internal violence. People may argue that the South African case is quite remote and its particular history is not relevant in this case. Um, and a democratic solution for a nation, for a binational community, or might be not viable because of what we have seen elsewhere. So how do you imagine the Palestinian case lining up with scenarios that have taken place in other contexts, where there's been a civil war, or there's been some kind of, invasion, and now we have people left over, and then they try to create a state afterwards. Have you thought about comparative cases? And if so, which one do you, in your expert opinion, lines up to be most similar, and why that case um, does or does not give us more ground to believe in a democratic solution?
Thank you for that. I'd like to start by rejecting the premise a little bit, and then I'll answer all the question, which is to say that I don't think there's any one case that can really line up. And that's the point, is that, trying to sort of take a cookie cutter approach to this is bound to fail. Precisely for all those reasons, that every conflict is different, every occupation, every colonial project is different. They may share a lot of characteristics, and ending them might require some of the same steps. But ultimately, what's required to move on to a better future is going to be unique to that local and specific situation. That said, I'll name a few different situations that we looked at and what I found to be inspiring from them. So the one that I've been thinking a lot about lately is Northern Ireland. And the lesson that I get from Northern Ireland is that you can change the situation without fixing everything and create a better situation. Ireland in general, it's not free of partisan violence, it's not free of militias, it's not free of intercommunal conflict, but it's nothing like it was, 40 years ago. The British Army is no longer occupying. I was just in London, and no trash cans were blowing up in the streets. Um, the day-to-day life in Belfast and elsewhere is I think much more normalized, and we're seeing a successful political system, successful not only in the day-to-day governance of Northern Ireland, but also in negotiating these really difficult larger national questions that have arisen from Brexit and elsewhere, of what the future of Ireland and its relationship with the United Kingdom and Europe looks like. And these are things that they're able to be that are able to take place and be discussed in a civil political environment. So that's one. Um, South Africa, again, it's not that, the dynamics that led to the fall of apartheid and the things that came after were very different. Um, in large part because the white South Africans never had plans to eliminate or push out Black South Africans. They saw them as an integral part of their economy, which gave them a lot of power. Um, However, the way that they systematically went through the Constitution and the laws and the court system, and worked on integrating the police and overseeing that process, gave us a lot of lessons on how that kind of thing is possible without eliminating the system entirely. You had a political system, a judicial system, a security state that sole purpose was to protect the white apartheid regime for decades, for 50 something years, right? And not exactly on a dime and not without any hiccups, but they were able to transition those systems into ones that served a constitution that was based on equality and democracy and human rights and dignity for all. And the ways that they went about that, from whether it's overseeing integration of security forces or revoking racist laws, those are things that we took a lot of inspiration from. And as well as in both Northern Ireland and South Africa, the way that they approach political prisoners. In Bosnia-Herzegovina, we looked a lot about how they restructured their judicial system, because you had sort of two national parties that were very suspicious of giving up power to the others. And there were lots of lessons that we learned there, but one of the ones that struck me was actually bringing in international justices to sit on the High Court of Justice um, with local justices, not only to be tiebreakers in cases where issues came down on national or ethnic lines, but also to help create and bring with them a culture of democratic judicial processes, which inherently doesn't exist under an apartheid regime, whether it's under the Palestinians living under apartheid or the Israelis who are enforcing it and implementing it. So those are the few of the ones that are on the top of my mind at the moment. But I'll just say, it's not just democratic transitions; it's also post-colonial transitions. It's also post-conflict situations. And again, I'm not advocating for Lebanon being a perfect place today, but Lebanon, has held up through civil war, through attacks on Israel. They still have a quasi-functioning government. The various parties still get together in the parliament and discuss issues, and that's not something to be completely discarded. Um, and yeah, Sarah, do you have anything to add to that?
I want to acknowledge that I know Sarah has to jump off very soon, and we're really grateful that she was able to join us in the beginning of the talk. And Sarah, if I want to give you a word before you leave. So if there's any time that you would like to just say your goodbye, you're more than welcome to do so.
I mean, I have
Uh,
10 more minutes.
yeah,
So I can stay on if there are questions. Maybe we
there are some more questions, but I just wanted to let people know, like if you were going to be leaving in 10 minutes, so if there's any other questions that people want to direct towards you, that they're more than welcome to do so. So I wanted to ask another question that was asked is, you at the beginning, one of the strong points of your proposal is to first and foremost acknowledge that there are ongoing crimes, right? And these ongoing crimes need to cease immediately, and there's no reason to wait for anything else to happen until that happens. And I think one of the strengths of your proposal is to prioritize this issue as opposed to, as you said, final issues. And my, the cynic in me makes it seem like getting the criminal acts to stop seems to face the same resistance as does the final issues. So, how do we, as people who are concerned about humanity and the people there, both the Jewish residents and the Palestinians who are there, how do we even get past the first goalpost here? I mean, how do we even get to a place where the crimes stop? Is there any way that we can imagine this in a realistic fashion?
Yeah, I mean, what is missing is political will. what is missing following the UN General Assembly resolution ordering Israel to end its illegal occupation by a September deadline that has already passed is a viable off-ramp, is a viable pathway for something different. Part of the reason why the international community is stuck and not increasing pressure on Israel to enforce the General Assembly resolution is because they don't know what follows. They don't know what to do next. And we're seeing a snippet of this, of course, in Gaza, where there is no viable future for Gaza that is in any way, resembles a normal state of affairs because no one has a plan. And what we're hoping to contribute is to encourage the international community to enforce the resolution with sanctions, with divestment, with global boycotts, in order to press Israelis to accept dismantling apartheid and occupation with a viable off-ramp. That is what we're proposing, that what we're putting forward. Now, it's a very dark and bleak reality in terms of what Palestinians are living and suffering under day to day. But it is also a moment of opportunity that we have not had in a very long time, where global public opinion is overwhelmingly supportive of Palestinian rights and freedom, overwhelmingly opposed to occupation and apartheid. We have seen sanctions imposed on Israel that we've never seen before, including over a dozen countries imposing arms embargoes, including, of course, most importantly, Germany and Italy, the number 2 and number 3 biggest providers of weapons to Israel. We've seen over a dozen countries end diplomatic relations, withdraw their ambassadors. Obviously, the United States is the elephant on the planet that prevents more action. But even in the United States, there is dramatic change. I never thought I would see in my lifetime political candidates running on a platform, a campaign pledge, not to take money from AIPAC, running on a platform and a campaign pledge to support Palestinian liberation. That is pretty dramatic and pretty different. There is now a knockdown, tear-down fight within the Republican Party over the unconditional support to Israel that we have had for decades. It's a debate that I have never seen before. Sadly, it's not yet happening within the Democratic Party, but it's emerging because voters are voting in ways that are sending a very strong message. And it's impossible to pretend that the election of Zohran Mamdani in New York City was not also a national referendum on Israel. It was the center point of Cuomo's challenge to Mayor Mamdani was his support for Palestine. And he lost very, very badly. So the political winds are changing. We have humanity on our side. And the only question is, can we bring governments to the table to increase the pressure on Israel? Can we educate and support Israeli Jews to understand that there is a better way? There is a way for them to live, not as a criminal state, not as citizens of a criminal state. And, I think that we rely on the black swans of our century that show us that the impossible, the unthinkable can happen and things can be for the better. The Berlin Wall falls, the Soviet Union crumbles, the Arab uprisings topple regimes. And now even a Muslim immigrant is elected mayor of New York City. So, we must have faith in humanity to choose better answers, to surprise us with better outcomes, or else, frankly, we throw in the towel for everything that each of us here on the phone hopes for and wishes for. And we need to feed that hope with concrete, practical plans, with toolkits that will help us translate our hope into practical steps.
I just want to add one thing to that, which is that political will exists on two levels. In the international community, it's absolutely necessary to end the support for Israeli crimes if we ever want to see them end. But those crimes will not end unless Israel agrees to end them. And that's one of the main reasons that we're still in the situation we are in today is the very skewed power dynamics which exist on two levels. Again, one in the international support that Israel receives, but also in the power it has both politically and militarily over Palestinians and and anyone who might want to help them. So the political will in the international community is critical, but it's not the end goal. The end goal is that we have to change political will and the willingness of Israelis and Palestinians, but primarily Israelis, since they hold all the power, to be willing to try something else. And that will only happen if that international pressure comes, because nobody gives up that type of privilege and power voluntarily. And unfortunately, that's the reality that we're trying to change.
I'm going to pause here to thank you and jump off and let you continue this discussion.
Thank you so much, Sarah Whitson. Thanks for joining us, and I hope that the book has the impact that you hope for.
We'll have to get your advice on translating this into Turkish and Arabic.
Inshallah. Michael, I had one question about the kind of rhetoric that follows up with suggestions of a democratic future, which is basically that this is an anti-Semitic plan, given the fact that it, at the end of the day, is trying to dissolve the only Jewish state in the world. How would you respond to such criticism?
First of all, by acknowledging the fear that underlies it, but I think it's a distortion of the question that's in front of us, which is that it's not dismantling the Jewish national existence. It's not dismantling a Jewish homeland. It's dismantling a regime that has predicated having a Jewish homeland and state on supremacy and oppression. And we have to be able to disentangle those two things. Excuse me. There's nothing wrong with national self-determination. There's nothing wrong with statehood. What the problem is how it's manifested. And it's been manifested in a way that is reliant on apartheid, on occupation, and intermittent genocide, be it in 1948 or 2023, in Gaza. And those are the things that have to change. And I believe that, our approach to this carefully considered not just the needs of liberation of Palestinians, that is the primary concern of the moment, but nothing is going to be sustainable. Nothing is going to be acceptable in a way that Israeli Jews would even consider it if it doesn't answer their own needs as well, for security, for prosperity, and for having a homeland. And, that may require rethinking what Zionism looks like. And, for many people, it may require abandoning it as a concept, but that does not mean abandoning a homeland or safety or even a connection to the land for Jewish Israelis. And so I reject the concept, the suggestion that that's anti-Semitic, because, it was not anti-Semitic or anti, uh, white people when the world demanded South Africa, democratize, and just as it hasn't been in a million other situations. It just so happens that this is the one Jewish state, and that Jewish state also happens to be an apartheid state. And so disentangling those two ideas, I think, is key to really getting past that argument. And I think it's largely a straw argument because it avoids discussing the actual issue, which is, okay, then how do you end apartheid? And again, as Sarah Lee put it, or I put it before, you know, we don't think that this is the only solution here, but it's a solution. And if folks have better ideas, then we'd love to hear them. The problem is that nobody's been discussing any alternatives, which means that everybody is sort of conceptually stuck in this current unacceptable one state undemocratic reality.
Um, from forgive me about the fact that a lot of these questions are a little cynical, but maybe it's
No,
just the
please,
moment,
please.
it's the moment that or maybe even the lack of optimism people have, in this moment. Another issue that comes forward is the fact that um, sometimes societies do become radicalized. I mean, your plan has an optimism built in it about the desires of everyday people, that everyday people really don't want the current state of affairs. They'd much rather be in a different situation. However, and maybe this is propaganda, maybe we're getting disinformation, but sometimes it feels as though those who occupy the land from between the river and the sea, feel like they have a privileged right to do so. It's not just this alienated regime that is misrepresenting the uh, docile and innocent desires of the everyday man and construing it for themselves. But people have given a lot of sacrifice and have, come to the land with a divine right to be there. And therefore, like any kind of proposal that tries to make equal that demand with another person's demand, a metaphysical demand, may I say, for something like a historical demand, these are not equal on any level. So um, I'm not saying that this is true or not. I'm just saying that when you have one side that feels that their demand, and I'm not here, and I'm actually trying to say that the assumption of the plan that there are these, like, normal everyday people you're speaking to, but rather there's people who are driven by this kind of divine political theology. How are you going to convince them? I mean, it seems like even down to the regular person that we've got a problem, because over time, societies do radicalize. I mean, they begin to see their own histories differently. They begin to see their own narratives differently. Maybe this wasn't the case in 1948, but after some time, it seems like we are dealing with a population uh, whose own narratives have shifted and changed over time.
I
I don't
don't
know if
think
there
you
was I don't know if there was a question there or a criticism there, but
no, no,
maybe
no.
you can
There's
respond
a
to that
lot.
whole.
There's a lot
Yeah.
to engage with there. First off, I think you're not wrong in that Israeli society has radicalized in a way that makes a lot of this seem like science fiction, and we understand that. And to be fair, I'm not surprised when I hear Palestinians saying, I don't want to live with the people who carried out a genocide against my people. These are real feelings, and these are real sentiments, and these are real shifts in public opinion and political views. But public opinion and political views are fluid. The fact that they've changed means that they can change. And that doesn't mean they'll go in the right direction or the correct direction, but it also means that there is an opportunity over time to change them again. Now, you said that, everyday people don't want this situation. I think that's true on the Palestinian side. I don't think that's true for most Jewish Israelis, as you were suggesting. Um, However, if the privileges that make it comfortable and sustainable and make it seem like there's a future there um, with that system, if those start to crumble, if those start to be taken away, then the desire for a normal life will ideally drive people to seek an alternative to the current reality or the reality at that point along a trajectory in the future where sanctions are too great, where violence is um, doesn't feel winnable, where the economic comforts and the ability to thrive economically are no longer there, when travel and the sort of normalized acceptance that Israelis have around the world disappears. And I'm not saying all this is necessarily going to happen tomorrow. I'm saying that it could happen. And if it happens, and we're advocating for this, then then the world can come to Israel and say, there's a different way. And, just like, a lot of people tend to cynically say, where's the Palestinian Mandela? But my counter to that is we need an Israeli de Klerk. We need an Israeli leader who's willing to say, this future, this trajectory that we're on is not good enough for my people. And therefore, I want to seek a different way. And maybe this book lands on their desk, maybe somebody else's does. Maybe, they have the ideas on their own. But the idea is to have a proof of concept that there is a different way, that you can dismantle apartheid and occupation without discarding the entire question of Jewish safety, of Palestinian self-determination, of Jewish self-determination, and that there are ways to go about that. So the uncomfortable part of this is that these kind of shifts won't happen without some pain and suffering, and one side is experiencing that today. But this idea of ripeness, which was popularized by a scholar named William Zartman, suggests that when the costs become too great, people start to look for different answers, for different paths forward. Now, Zartman also had an interesting essay or article a few years after his initial one, specifically about Israel-Palestine, posing the difficult question that I think you alluded to, which is that both Israelis and Palestinians have built resistance or has built suffering into their national ethos. And so getting to a point where that suffering is too great to handle is, I think, harder than in a lot of other contexts. Because for Palestinians, it's sumud, and that existence is resistance, and all we have to do is stay on the land. Um, for Israelis, it's the shadow of the Holocaust and saying we can't ever put ourselves in a situation where somebody else has the power over us to threaten our future. And both of those ethos sort of have a built-in allowance for quite a bit of suffering that means a point of ripeness is quite far away. But it's possible. I hope that it can get there without more violence, and that diplomatic and economic pressure will be enough. But the truth of the matter is that a process also has to go on within Israeli society. We're not suggesting what that needs to be. A process needs to go on among Palestinians where they all reach a point where, or at least a critical mass of people and leaders reach a point where they're willing to try something different. And that doesn't mean total de-radicalization has to happen. I'm not suggesting that anybody be sent to de-radicalization camps or anything that along that vein, but that these are processes that are multidimensional, and as people's day-to-day lives change, the way that they think about the world and the ideas that they might be open to also change.
Thank you. I wanted to revisit that one slide that you had shared, where you had the layout, the blueprint, especially starting with the caretaker government and the transition. If you could put that back up, there were a few questions from that. Is that possible?
Let me try. Um, let's see. I don't know that it is. I'm sorry.
Okay,
The
no
security
problem.
settings on my
Uh,
computer
no,
don't
that's
want me to
fine.
share my screen.
It's no problem. So the one of the main issues that was there was towards the end, where you started talking about security integration, and you spoke about other steps in the program. The caretaker government seems to be a transitional period. There's certain long-term concerns. For example, how do we know that after the caretaker government is there, that militias may not form again, terrorist groups may not form again? There's certain, I mean, these are security concerns that I'm sure people, because that's how it started. I mean, there were national terrorist groups on the ground that made it possible to make a claim for statehood. So we could see security fracture again. Do you think that the blueprint prevents that from happening?
You know, all change carries an immense amount of risk. And I don't know any democratic country that doesn't have a domestic counterterrorism program because, or any country for that matter, because there are always going to be people who try and change the system or take power in the system through illegitimate means, usually violence. Now, that doesn't mean so you can't prevent it from happening. There will always be people trying to start militias. There will always be people seeking to use terrorism or other means of violence to affect political outcomes. The question is how you mitigate those spoilers, and in conflict resolution terminology, groups like that are called spoilers. So, you know, again, it's how do you mitigate them? And we do as much as we can to try and do that. One of the ways is through radical inclusion. Not that radical, but radical for today's reality, in that, you know, an effective DDR, which is disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration campaign, which is, something that there's lots of expertise and scholarship and experience in the world about that can be drawn on, is not just how do you take guns away from people, but how do you give those people both another income, but also a political outlet for the goals they were trying to achieve through violence to achieve them democratically. So if that, part of that is integrating security forces. They're it's not anything compared to the Israeli army, and it has a very different mission, but there is a fairly large Palestinian police force. And I think if you integrate civilian police, you have a much better chance of creating a sort of everyday experience of security and safety that is one of the major components that can mitigate the emergence of spoiler groups. Chaos and crime and disorder really feeds the creation of militias, which oftentimes start out as criminal and then gain political aims. The inclusion of political parties that are outlawed today, as long as they commit to the democratic process, is another way. Because all of a sudden, the political forces that are driving violence are, ideally committed to the political process, to a democratic political process. And that includes a lot of different elements, which I hope I can get into more specifics, but I think we detail it pretty comprehensively in the book. That means we have a consociational approach for the transition of democratic representation, which means that we sort of artificially maintain parity between Palestinians and Jews while encouraging them to align politically, not necessarily on ethnic or national lines. Um, and it includes, it's going to have to include security guarantees from the outside for Israelis that, the moment they start to give up the keys to their very powerful military and even nuclear weapons, that they're not going to be, immediately attacked by outside forces. Um, a new security doctrine that allows, as we discussed in South Africa, that allows the institutions of a regime that was meant to serve one people to serve both, to build the kind of trust where people are willing to to allow these new institutions to provide for them what was not provided for them before, and what militant groups oftentimes, attempted to fill those voids. Um, so there's a lot of processes. It's a lot of trust building. It's a slow process. That's why there's a transitional government and not just an immediate switch to full democracy, or at least direct or representative democracy. But it's a process. It's not free of risk, and there's no guarantee that it succeeds. But that's true of any process. And we see threats to democracy, emerging in some of the most established democracies in the world. And it's not about the prevention of the emergence of those threats. It's how you mitigate them. It's how you overcome them. And many of the sort of steps and ideas that we put forth in this book are meant precisely for that, to create resilience and a good chance of success for a different future, as opposed to one of constant war and fighting and zero-sum approaches to the other.
Michael, I'm sure when you were writing the book, there was you took a lot of time to go back and try to debug the plan based on, you know, evidence that you were gathering. Um, which bug in the plan was the hardest to debug? I mean, which part of the plan did you find faced probably the most amount of resistance from the people that you were talking about, scholars, because you surveyed a wide variety of different stakeholders, and which part of the plan for you was the most challenging?
Um, you know, I'll first say what are the two things that we got the most resistance on. The first is not part of the plan. It's at all. It's the how do you get there question of, this cognitive inability of folks to imagine a place where political will could exist because it seems so distant today. Because, on the face of things, the reality is worse than it's ever been. We do believe that that creates a window of opportunity, as Sarah Lee spoke about before. But that's I think the biggest barrier that folks faced when engaging with this. As far as the actual plan, the one of the things that we faced most resistance from, primarily from Palestinians, is the fact that we don't immediately resolve the question of refugees, and that the Palestinian refugee diaspora isn't directly involved in the transition process. Now, we did that for a number of reasons, and we had to come to peace with that for a number of reasons, understanding that 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 no answer that we have here was going to satisfy everybody, and that's okay. Um, the reasons are that the scholarship on transitional justice really has a consensus that it has to be a locally led process, that you can't impose this kind of thing from the outside. And so while we looked at the institutional transition elements of transitional justice, which form the main part of, or the bulk of this plan, the parts about actual restorative justice and refugees are ones that A, can't be dictated from the outside, and B, you really need to know what the political structures and outlines of what states are going to exist um, are going to be before you can decide how you're going to address these issues.
But Michael, I mean, isn't Israel already an inside outside, given the fact that a lot of Israelis have dual citizenship and they're very mobile and they're international? I mean, the only difference between the Israeli and Jewish diaspora and Palestinian diaspora is a passport. I mean, the fact that, Israelis are already internationalized. I mean, who's inside and outside of Israel really? I mean, for example, there's an exorbitant amount of influence that the Jewish diaspora is able to hold into the process that what unfolds in Israel, in a way that the Palestinian diaspora is not. So how do we square that circle?
I mean, I think
Forgive me for interrupting you.
no, no, it's actually a more interesting question. I think that first off, that's true. Although there's a few nuances that I think make a difference here. One is that diaspora Jews and Israelis cannot vote either today in Israel or in our plan. We're talking about the people who are currently residing between the river and the sea, and that's because we're not trying to solve the whole thing. We're trying to look at the specific problems of apartheid and occupation with the belief that the larger issues will be more possible to resolve once those crimes are ended. The second thing is, well, actually three parts. So the second is that you're correct that the Jewish and Israeli diaspora has an immense amount of influence, both on driving international support for Israel and its ability to withstand the demands of international law and institutions and the pressures that it does face, and that has to change. And we are seeing that change. I think that's one of the few changes that we are seeing. which is that the civil, like the popular support, oftentimes in most cases led by diaspora Palestinians and Palestinian refugees, are what is changing, and our belief and our hope that in any democratic world that that type of shift eventually trickles up to the political echelons and leads to different policies. The only thing I would really challenge about what you said is the Palestinian diaspora and refugees have always been at the forefront of the Palestinian liberation movement, whether that's organizing protests in Italy or, the PLO organizing militarily in Jordan and Lebanon and Libya and Tunisia. Um, these are, it's not the same type of power, it's not the same type of influence, but I don't. Israel has tried very hard to cut those two populations, to dissect them and create cleavages and to remove the connections and collaboration between them. That's not what we're asking to do here. We understand that it's deeply problematic for Palestinians to not immediately reunite refugees and those Palestinians who managed to stay, whether it's in 1948 Israel or the occupied territory of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza. But unfortunately, practicality was our main driving force here. And whereas there's zero ability to resolve those issues today, we think that by first ending the crimes of occupation and apartheid, that it becomes possible to end those. So it's a disappointing answer. It's not one that I hope to have to sort of push off to somebody else in this way when we started this project. But unfortunately, I do think that, while creating the framework and foundations for resolving those questions is a necessary part of any plan like ours. And we go in, there's several chapters about how to lay those foundations for that kind of justice to be possible. From, returning some property immediately to creating family reunification possibilities for refugees to actually creating ways for Palestinian refugees who are an immediate threat to be able to return immediately. And let's be honest, the other big part of that is creating freedom of movement within the territory. A huge number of Palestinian refugees, millions of them, are displaced within the territory between the river and the sea, whether that's internally displaced within Israel, whether that's displaced from villages that no longer exist from within what's modern day Israel to the West Bank or to Gaza. We know the vast majority of Gazans are actually refugees in origin. That by starting to address those issues there, that we're setting the foundations, laying the path, and creating the precedent for resolving refugee issues and giving voice to Palestinian refugees. In a way that my goal is not to give them equal footing to Jews or Israelis living overseas. It's to create a place where their rights can be realized. And that I think is the primary driving force behind the difficult decisions that we had to make. And again, this is not necessarily how things should or must go. This is a proof of concept that it's possible to address these issues, that it's possible to get to a better place where we can foreseeably imagine resolving the bigger questions of political outcomes and refugee return.
Um, as we're talking about reactions, I also wanted to ask you. It's a very, very fresh book. It came out very recently. What has been the most encouraging response that you have interacted with so far?
The encouraging part is I think twofold. One, it's that we haven't been laughed out of the room, um, which I think is a result of the fact that people are hungry for new ideas. That I think we started this long before the genocide in Gaza in 2023, and even then, I think there was this real thirst and appetite for a different political program. And we're not trying to dictate a political program for Israelis or Palestinians, but we are trying to show that a different path is possible. And seeing how when people saw how systematically and methodically and granularly we were approaching that question, simply to demonstrate that it's possible, that you can dismantle apartheid, that you can dismantle occupation and not be left with this, chaotic void that leaves one or both parties in an existential crisis, physically. Um, that people are really thirsty to both receive and engage with those new types of ideas. Um, I can't really, I don't want to either inflate the importance of these or or um, or betray confidentiality, but even among diplomats, I hear that same sort of refreshing appetite for new ideas, whether it has the political feat to be brought to the leadership of their countries today or not. That there are there are other ways of thinking about the future, and especially for those countries who might be considering more meaningful sanctions and isolation vis-a-vis Israel, that there's a sort of political foundation for how they can approach doing that, and really to get to the question that we were speaking of in the beginning, um, to create an off-ramp for that pressure. That's an incredibly important element to getting anybody in the policy world to consider something different, is to explain to them in granular terms what comes next.
We're coming to the end. Michael, I just wanted to ask one last a question from my end. Not everybody wakes up in the morning saying that they're going to solve uh, the Israeli-Palestinian the issue. So on a personal level, like maybe for our audience and listeners, maybe you can give a little bit of background about your motivations, what got you into this project, and what really kept you going in putting this forward.
Sure. So, my personal background is I'm Jewish. My mother was a child Holocaust survivor. She learned to walk in a concentration camp, and was a refugee in that time and afterwards, and got quite an amazing opportunity to build a new life and family in the United States after that. My father is Israeli, English Israeli, and I have three half siblings who were all born and raised there. So I have a fairly strong family connection to the place. I lived there, most of the time working as a journalist for more than 15 years in Palestine and Israel. And it's a society, both societies really, because as an American, as a journalist, as somebody without an accent, I was able to really get to know, I think, both Palestinian and Israeli societies in a way that very few people, at least from my position, are able to. Um, and built up an incredible knowledge of how these systems of oppression really operate through my journalistic experience. I'd never, I still would push back against the notion that I'm trying to solve this. I think I have far more humility than that. And I think we say it a few times in the book that despite the title, this is not a peace plan. This is a plan to dismantle apartheid and occupation. And the things that keep me going, I couldn't, I had to take several months off from writing this at the beginning of the genocide because it was just, too much to imagine something so positive and optimistic in those moments. But what keeps me going is two things. One is that I feel I have something to contribute, whether that's, the ability to translate an understanding of the system's oppression into, reverse engineering how to dismantle them, how to speak to the international community and Israelis and Palestinians with empathy about these issues, and they're the things that sort of hold back movement. And lastly, and this is I think the most inspiring and the least inspiring, is that the biggest moments of change in this world have often come without any warning, at least that people were able to foresee in the short-term future, whether that's the fall of South Africa, whether that's the fall of the Berlin Wall and the Soviet Union, even the Black Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland, and oftentimes in much more violent ways, where we see war and immense violence lead to an astoundingly different outcome on the other side. And the biggest one there is Germany. I mean, the fact that I have an article coming out about this soon. I recently visited a concentration camp with my mother at the invitation of the German government, which, considering the history, is a wild thing to imagine. But that society, and not by choice, but by by facing defeat, was forced to reinvent itself in a way that that really has put its historical wrongs into a driving force of what its identity is today, and certainly in some problematic ways as well. But the fact that so much change can happen and so dramatically and so quickly, albeit not without cost, we're seeing the costs today. That's where I draw most of my hope. That there's a tipping point out there somewhere, and we don't know where it is, but we have to keep pushing and preparing the infrastructure and the scaffolding for what to land on when that tipping point comes.
Well, Michael, my questions have run out. And if I want to give you the last word, if there's anything else you would like to add, you're more than welcome to.
No, just thank you again for the invitation, for the provocative and smart, engaging questions that you asked. We really appreciate it. This is, as I said before, something that we're not trying to sell as the perfect plan, but rather a proof of concept that it's possible to have a plan, and that where a lot of these transitions have failed is where there was no plan. So it's important to be thinking about these things before that big moment of change comes, so that we know how to act on the other side. And lastly, a little shameless self-promotion. The book From Apartheid to Democracy is available on Amazon and Bookseller and wherever else you get your books.
Yeah, and I really encourage everybody, especially from amongst our own audience, because we have at SIGA, um, and this is the main reason that we were really excited about your book, was really thought about the idea of how to. We've been thinking really seriously about how to let's say prioritize the dismantling of the apartheid system. And I think that very few people have gotten to the nitty gritty of trying to figure out, well, how does that actually come about? And you're ahead of the game. I think that your book really helps us to start thinking about it. We may disagree, about what comes first, what comes after, but at the end of the day, very few people, especially at the very high levels of diplomacy, geopolitics, people aren't prioritizing the very obvious thing that's obvious to all of us, that there's an apartheid regime, you know, let's get rid of that. And then
And as Sarah Lee said, these are man-made problems, which means they can have man-made solutions.
exactly. And I think that's what's very encouraging. And I want to thank you on behalf of SIGA, behalf of Dr. Sammy and Jamila and everybody here. We're really, really happy that you were able to join us. And I hope people read your work and read the book.
Thank you very much.
All right, take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
And for all of those who are online, please stay tuned for our next book discussion next month. You will be able to see the announcements very soon. Thanks for joining us, and